Last week the family and I headed up north for a well-deserved holiday in and around Lancashire. We were going to be visiting Blackpool for a few days, but we also had an opportunity to visit some other museums, and of course I made sure that we did. And one of the ones that was on my hit list to do was the Imperial War Museum North in Trafford in Manchester. I've been wanting to do this place for a long time, and we finally were in the approximate area, so we did it one day. We took a day trip down to Manchester from where we were staying to visit the Imperial War Museum North. Now it's in a very unusual building. It's a modernistic style building designed by Daniel Libeskind, and it's meant to represent how conflict has fragmented the world. So this building looks really bizarre from the outside, and it really does help break down your preconceptions of what a museum should look like and prepares you for something that's a little bit different on the inside as well. So maybe not to everyone's taste, but I quite like the look of the building. Bizarre but very thought-provoking. But of course outside you've got the usual trappings of a museum, including this T-55 tank. You know, everything you've come to expect from the Imperial War Museum. They've got access to a lot of really large and interesting exhibits. And when you get inside, you're immediately greeted by this Harrier hanging from the ceiling, or suspended up in the air. And again, this is something that the Imperial War Museum, I always think, do really well. You look at these objects and think, how the hell did they get them in here? So a very good way to start the museum off. And then you move on to the actual exhibits themselves, and as you would expect from the Imperial War Museum, you've got some really useful and interesting things there that help tell the story, including this ship's bell from the Lusitania. Now this was the ship that was sunk on the 7th of May 1915 that was instrumental in helping to bring America into the war. It was a passenger ship and it was sunk by unrestricted U-boat activity in the Atlantic, and the disaster, the loss of life, helped bring America into the war. But as well as these really important objects, you've got smaller objects such as this tank visor or face shield from the First World War. Now I've seen these in various museums before, but they're always an incongruous and bizarre looking item. They look like something you'd expect from the medieval period, but they were there designed to help protect the faces and the eyes of early tank crews from hot metal shards and fragments that might be flying around inside the tank when they were being hit with bullets and shells on the outside. So I like these sort of small items because they help tell a very interesting and personal part of the story. But also, as you would expect from the Imperial War Museum, there's lots of interesting photos, including a picture here from the Battle of the Marne, so very early in the First World War. And you'd look at this photo and you wouldn't think, you know, if you're not interested in history, to the layman looking at this photograph, they wouldn't realise that this is the First World War. These men are wearing uniforms that you would expect from perhaps the end of the 19th century. And of course the warfare in that early part of the First World War was very different from what we've stereotypically come to know at the end. So these photographs are very interesting. But of course later on you get very stereotypical First World War photographs, like this picture of what I think is a Mark IV tank surrounded by British infantry wearing their typical Brodie style helmets. You know, you'd look at that and go instantly First World War. But as well as pictures of men in action, you've also got plenty of examples of photographs showing the consequences. So like these troops carrying an injured man from the front. And this museum, as does the one in London, it doesn't shy away from showing the consequences of war. And there'll be more on that as we go through these photographs. But there's also some very interesting original artwork as well as photographs. So this painting, for instance, showing a factory back in the UK, I believe it is, making aircraft. Now again, a picture that I've not seen before, very interesting, tells a little bit about the tale of the home front. But to return to items that have a particular interest in and historical significance, I came across this Royal Horse Artillery 13-pounder field gun, and at first I thought, yeah, very interesting field gun, seen plenty of these before. And then you read the information bar with it, and it turns out that this was the gun that fired the British Army's first shell of World War I on the 22nd of August 1914 near a town called Binch, I think that's how you pronounce it, in Belgium. The gun was later hit and the crew were killed, but the gun was repaired and saw service right to the end of the war. But very interesting because it was that gun that fired that first shell. It's an iconic piece, and only the Imperial War Museum could end up with an item like this. And then across from that gun, you've got a different type of gun, something taken from a German A7V tank. So this is a 57mm gun. It would have been in the front of the A7V, and in fact it was taken from an A7V that was captured by the British, brought back to England and actually put on display at Horse Guards. And then, most annoyingly, they decided they didn't need it later after the war, and it was broken up for scrap in 1921. So that now the only existing A7V, original A7V, is actually in Australia. And then at the end of the section on the First World War, there is an interesting panel which anyone with any knowledge of history will look at that and sigh ironically, because it mentions that this is the last war that anyone will ever probably fight, and you know full well that it isn't. Then from this section you go on to the Second World War, and in the Second World War area of the museum you're greeted by one of my favourite tanks, the infantry tank Mark IV, or the Matilda II, Queen of the Desert. The signs kept saying don't touch, but I couldn't help myself because I do love this tank, and I love this counter camouflage pattern. I've painted some of these myself, and it was a great opener, if you like, to the Second World War section for me. And then we move on to, as I've mentioned before, the museum here doesn't shy from telling you, showing you the consequences of war. And again, another original art piece, and this one by Leonid Roseman is a very powerful, intensely disconcerting painting of two firemen about to be killed as a building collapses on them. This photograph is reasonably famous. I've seen it as a photograph, but I've never seen the original painting, and it is, as I've already described, intensely disconcerting to look at and very moving. But there's also original photographs, as I mentioned, so you've also got pictures of things like the refugees, and as I say, this museum doesn't shy away from telling you the consequences of war. This is an educational place. It's more than just facts, figures and calibers and pieces of equipment. There's a story to be told, the story of the human side of war, and this museum did it really, really well. And then we move on, and you have an example of a small barrage balloon. I thought they were much larger. I didn't realise they did small ones like this, but they had that up on display. Quite interesting for me to look at. But then again, we go back to documents and other items that the museum has on display, such as this speech signed by Montgomery and aimed at the 8th Army in Africa. Again, brings you back down to that personal level, ties you to a particular moment in history. And then on the flip side of it, you have silly things like this Toby jug of Montgomery, part of something that was probably sold as almost as a propaganda item back home. And of course the home front is an essential part of the war. We don't represent it in our games, but it's an essential part of telling that story and understanding, and part of our popular culture, if you like. And they had some examples of some toys and even some comic book magazines, which are fascinating to me because I've had some of these in the past. But they tell part of the wider story, the implications of war and how it affects our culture and our popular understanding of our history. But then we'll return back to, again, a painting of an aid station. Again, another original art piece that was on display. Again, reminding us that there was a very real world consequence to the war, not only at the front lines, but also at home. And that's the only bits of the museum. We didn't have a lot of time, so I did miss out some of the more modern stuff. I was particularly interested in the First and Second World War. But then, when you go outside, and again, you've got this iconic building, a very interesting collection and well worth visiting. I think it's a really good family museum actually, because it hits different levels. There's lots of information and panels which perhaps kids aren't necessarily interested in reading, but also some very interesting artifacts that will catch their eye, and you can talk to them about it. And obviously if you're interested in your military history or your military artifacts, there's stuff there that will give you pause for thought and be interesting to look at. So I actually think this is a really good museum. I'm really glad that we managed to get to visit it. And if you're ever in the area, I would heartily recommend taking your family to see there. Now, entry to the museum is free, although you do have to pay for car parking, but you know that wasn't much. So very well worth the visit. Although I would say to you, avoid the ring road around Manchester. It was a nightmare.